Hello everyone, thanks for joining me for what I hope will be an all-inclusive class on the subject of tea. So what is tea exactly? Well, there is tea in the broad sense and tea in the correct, more narrow sense. In the broad sense, it's an extraction of anything from leaves, roots, seeds, tree bark, you name it. If it's brewed, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be hot, it can be extracted in cold water as well. But that is a kind of a misnomer. That comes from the real definition of tea, which is leaves from a particular bush, a particular species of plant that makes the beverage we all know from tea bags that you buy at the grocery store. And the fact that you extract the flavor of those leaves by submerging them in hot water. So later that kind of ballooned into this more broad concept of pretty much anything being considered a tea. So we are here today to talk about real tea, so the bush. And I always like to start with asking the question, so how many kinds of tea are there? And the answers are always pretty extraordinary. People say, oh my, there are hundreds, and they start listing them. There's black tea and green tea and gold tea, and there's orange pekoe and black pekoe, and there's Assam, and there's Darjeeling, and there's Earl Grey, and there's hot tea, and there's cold tea, and there's English breakfast and Scottish breakfast and English afternoon tea, and then they go on and on. Whoa, hold on a second. We're comparing apples to oranges to cucumbers there. All of those things are multiple variants that we would have to get into. It goes beyond the scope of how many types of tea there are. Let me make this real simple for you. There are three. There are only three types of tea. Now, I would argue that it's possible that there is a fourth, and I'll explain that. So what are the three types of tea? Well, first of all, there is green tea. I'm sure you've seen that in stores. A lot of people say, well, that's Chinese tea. Well, not necessarily. You can have green tea in any country. Any country produces tea, produces green tea. Although some of the most famous green teas are obviously associated with China, both mainland and Taiwan, as well as Japan, and also Southeast Asia. So what is green tea? So you have these green leaves on a bush, and you pluck these leaves, and they toss them into a pan. Well, at least in the olden days. Now they have special ovens and stuff where it's all modernized, but traditionally they would be tossed into a pan over a fire, and they would be tossed just like you're tossing chicken wings in barbecue sauce or something, right? And what you're doing is you're just evaporating all the water out of them, so you're dehydrating them basically. And when they're dehydrated, they're still green leaves. So what makes that different than black tea? Have you ever seen black leaves on a bush? No, not at all. So what they are, it's the exact same leaves of the same kind of bush, and they pick those green leaves, and they'll put them on a kind of a rugged surface and go over them with a roller. And what that does is it presses against the jaggedness of that surface, and it makes bruises all over the leaf. And when it does that, it breaks the veins in the leaf and allows them to release an enzyme which starts the process of decomposition. And so around all of those little bruises, you'll see black spots or dark brown spots, sometimes even medium brown spots, depends on what kind of leaves they are, and also how they are raised. So as the decomposition progresses, eventually the whole tea turns, or the whole leaf, turns medium brown, dark brown, sometimes even literally black. And that's what we know as black tea. So it's basically decomposed green tea leaves. And then the third kind, which is a lot less known, is this thing right here, known as oolong tea. So what is oolong tea? Well, it's kind of between the two. So basically what they do is they take those green leaves and they bruise them, and they start getting those spots on them, and they let the spots grow a little bit. But before the entire leaf is consumed with decomposition, they steam them. And what the steaming does is it breaks down that enzyme. It destroys the enzyme that is causing the decomposition, and it arrests that process. And so then they take those and toss them in the pan. And so the one is tossed green, so it stays green. One is tossed black, so it stays black. The other one is part green with black splotches, and you pan toss them then, and it stays that color. So you get three entirely different flavor profiles, oolong being literally my favorite of the three. I love oolong tea. Some people would argue, well, there's a fourth one, and that would be white tea. But what is white tea? So white tea is a different cultivar. In other words, a different species of the tea bush, whose leaves have tiny little white, sometimes almost silvery hairs on the surface of the leaf. I'm sure we've all seen hairy leaves on certain plants, like sage, for example. The herb is kind of a fuzzy leaf, right? And so the leaves appear white, but you can't go by that. You got to go by the process. What do you do with those? Well, you pick those off the bush and you put them in a pan and you toss them and dehydrate them. And what do you have? You have green tea. So just because it's got little white fuzzy hairs on it doesn't make it any less green tea, because you're pan firing it when it's green. I'm not sure if I've ever heard of anyone decomposing them and making black tea out of a white tea leaf, but anything's possible. You could certainly do that. You could certainly do that with an oolong as well. So is there a fourth kind? Yes, I would argue that there is, and here's why. And that would be this guy right here. This is known as kuki cha. So this is a Japanese thing, and kuki means twig and cha means tea. And so it's twig tea. So what is that exactly? Well, it's not the branches of the bush, but every leaf is connected to a branch with a stem, and that stem is can get a little on the woody side. So they snip all those apart. So you got all these little stems. And what do you do with the little stems? Well, they pan fire them and they dehydrate them. And now you've got something that some would argue, no, that also is a green tea, but is it? Because it's not the tea leaf, it's the stem leading to the leaf. Sometimes they'll even go through a second firing, which toasts them and turns them a little darker in color, so you've got kind of a roasted tea taste. One of the major elements of this, not only are you getting different flavor profiles, you've also got different levels of caffeine. And so some people will drink certain types of tea based on the fact that they're overly sensitive to caffeine. So black tea, anytime you decompose something, it's taking on more caffeine. So the black tea is the highest in caffeine, and then the oolong, because it's somewhere in the middle, and then the green tea, and then finally the kuki cha. The real appeal of it is the fact that it has almost no caffeine whatsoever. So that's the different types of tea. So what are all these other names that everybody knows? For example, Darjeeling tea. This is a Darjeeling. And you've probably heard of Ceylon tea. You've probably heard of Assam tea. What are those things? Well, those are appellations. An appellation is a particular land area where you could have literally the same varietal, the same species of tea bush, and plant them in two different places and get an entirely different flavor profile. So it has a lot to do with the amount of rainfall, it has to do with the amount of sunlight, it has to do with the elevation at which they're grown. It has to do with climate. Is it a warm, humid area? Is it a cool, dry area? What kind of soil do they have, which is known as terroir. So what kind of minerality is in the soil, what kind of water is available in the soil, and all of that's going to give you a different flavor. So Darjeeling is easily the most famous tea in the world. It's generally fairly expensive. The Darjeeling region is at that confluence of India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, right where they all come together. Is just a very tiny little patch of land there, which is where Darjeeling tea comes from. And it's got a very interesting, almost floral aroma to it. Nothing added to it. That's the natural flavor of that tea when it's grown in that region. Assam, on the other hand, so there's just a small land bridge of India above Bangladesh, and on the other side of Bangladesh, between Bangladesh and Burma, is a fairly large piece of India there. And in that area is where Assam tea comes from. Ceylon tea, there used to be an island nation known as Ceylon. It's now known as Sri Lanka. That's the little island off the southern tip of India. So Ceylon tea comes from there. So those are appellations. So what about this like orange pekoe versus black pekoe? Those are cultivars. So those are different species of tea bush. Same thing with people talking about gold tea. There is no gold tea. There's what are called gold tip tea, which is a green leaf that on the tip it stays kind of yellowish or gold, and the whole leaf doesn't necessarily turn green. Again, that's a different cultivar. It's a different species of bush. They're all tea. They're just like you have among grapes. You have Cabernet Sauvignon. You have Pinot Noir. You've got Chardonnay. You've got Chenin Blanc. So you've got all these different grape varietals. So we're talking about different varietals of tea, and they give you different flavors. So what then is a English breakfast versus an Irish breakfast versus an English afternoon tea? What is that all about? Well, that's yet a whole nother category. Those are not different types of tea, and they're not different cultivars. Those are blends. So certain people are very good at blending. For example, this is my favorite black tea. This is 5 Roses from South Africa, and it says right on top, a superior Ceylon blend. So these are tea leaves that come from Sri Lanka, but different regions of Sri Lanka, and they can be different kinds of tea. They can be, again, like orange pekoe, black pekoe, gold tip, all from the same land, but you're going to get a little different flavors out of them. So they will turn them black and dry them and blend those together so that you get a particular flavor profile. And so that's what all those things are. So English breakfast is one flavor profile. The English afternoon tea is a whole different profile. And so sometimes that's a consideration based on the amount of caffeine. You need the caffeine in the morning to help you wake up. You don't want to get all jittery in the afternoon, so maybe you're not going to have as much caffeine. Although in the afternoon, you might enjoy a more bold flavor in your tea versus in the morning. You don't want anything that's overpowering. So those are blends for different times of day, and the way that they like their tea in England is a little different than the way they like it in Scotland or Ireland or Wales or South Africa or Russia or China, Japan. They all like their tea in different ways. So those are blends. So the next thing I want to mention is flavored teas or infused teas. So something can be directly flavored. For example, this is a tea from Canada, and this is maple tea. So it's literally flavored with natural maple syrup. So there's a difference between actually flavoring something and infusing something. So I'm sure we've all heard of Earl Grey tea. So what makes Earl Grey tea Earl Grey tea? So it's black tea, and they flavor it with what's known as bergamot. So bergamot is it's a citrus fruit that's grown in Europe. It looks like an orange, tastes a little more like a lemon. Some people call it sour orange. And it's not so much the fruit itself, it's the rind, the skin off of that fruit. And what they'll do is they'll take that along with some flowers and sometimes some spices, and they will put them into a little sachet and then put that down into a big bag of black tea and tie that whole thing shut and seal it as well as they can and let the sachet sit in there for months. And so as it gives off its aroma, that aroma is absorbed into the tea leaves in that bag, and then they can remove that, and now you've got Earl Grey tea. So it's an infused flavor. It's just the aroma from something that's not even physically in contact with the tea leaves themselves. So you have flavored teas and infused teas, and do not confuse those with some of these things you see in the grocery store like this, say chai rooibos. You also get some of these things that are like raspberry teas and chamomile teas, and they are not teas at all. These are pseudo teas. So rooibos is a leaf from an entirely different bush that grows in Africa, but has an entirely different flavor profile. Most of the time that people are into this for two reasons. Number one, because there may be something in that infusion that has some health benefit. For example, chamomile tea is said to help people sleep at night. It makes you a little more restful. And then the converse of that is if you're trying to cut down on caffeine, if you have something that's entirely made up of herbs and flowers and fruits rather than actual tea, then you've got no caffeine. And so you don't have that caffeine issue. Also, I want to point out that there are some variations on the green tea theme from Asia. So one of the things that they'll do there is what's known as lapsang souchong. So when they go to pan fire their green leaves over an open fire, they'll put some sort of a tarp over that so that it keeps the smoke in, and it actually smokes the leaves. So it's actually a smoked tea. I will point out that that is an acquired taste. A lot of people never acquire the taste, and it's generally a little on the pricey side. So if you want to dabble in that a little bit, I would recommend, if you know a friend that has some, maybe have a cup of tea at a friend's house first before you put money into buying such a thing, because many people really don't like that. Also, there is what's known as gunpowder tea, or pinhead gunpowder. So they will take the green leaves and cut them into little thin strips, and then they'll roll them up into little BBs. And so what you're doing, you would do that before you would pan fire them, and you let them sit like that for a while. So basically they start producing a fungus in that rolled up leaf. And once you pan fire it, any of that biological activity is gone. It just kills it off once you fire it. So it's not like you're eating like any kind of active fungus or anything, but it does give it that real musty kind of smell and taste to it, almost like spent gunpowder. And so that you take these little BBs and you put those in your mug, and they will start to expand and unroll back into like whole leaf pieces, and it will release that mustiness in both the taste and the smell. Again, kind of an acquired taste. I really like that taste, actually. It's very good stuff. The other one I want to point out to you is matcha. So matcha is a Japanese tea. They have certain cultivars of tea in Japan that have these beautiful emerald green leaves on them. And what they do with matcha is they will grind that into a powder, almost like flour. And they don't really do like an infusion. They just put the powder right into the water. And this is what is used in the famous Japanese tea ceremony. So they'll put the powder in the water, and they'll stir it with a little whisk that's made out of bamboo. And you just drink it that way. So it's basically opaque. You can't even see through it. It's just a thick, murky, emerald green drink. But they also use this powder for other things. And it's very good for you if you're taking like a green supplement in your diet every day, like Kaio Green or something of that sort. You can use matcha instead, and it's very healthy for you. So they use it in ice cream and bonbons and pretty much anything you can imagine. Desserts, they'll sweeten it up. It's got a little bit of a grittiness to it, but it's actually very good and very healthy for you. So speaking of the powdered tea, that leads me to the last issue I wanted to discuss, which is how you do your tea infusions. So most of the time when you've got your typical tea bag, it'll be a little paper bag in there. More often than not, that's the scrap, and that's why box teas like this are so much cheaper than canned teas like this one, because it's as they're trying to roll up these teas or dry the teas or whatever. Once these things are dried, they'll break very easily, and you end up with all these little tiny particles of tea. We don't want to just throw those out. They're usable. Although it's just like anything else, when you fresh grind your coffee beans, you fresh grind your peppercorns over your food, you really want to break these things up upon use, because then you're releasing all this nice fresh flavor. If you pre-grind things, you're losing out on a lot of that flavor. So that's the downside to these simple tea bags. And in order to keep that from getting grit in your tea, you have to use that paper tea bag, because it's the finest possible mesh. Now when you get a little bit bigger pieces, sometimes even whole leaf, you'll notice that they will come in a pyramid shaped bag, which is actually like a fine mesh. And those are generally a little more expensive because you're getting whole leaves in those sometimes. You don't need the fine paper bag for those, because they're big enough pieces that they won't pass through that mesh. And then of course you get into your whole leaf tea. And how does whole leaf tea work? Well, once you get into here, you'll see that there's a bag, and in that bag is whole leaf. And so when you steep these, they'll actually swell and look more like, at least like strips of tea leaf. So what do you do with those? Well, you have to have an infuser. Some people call it a tea ball. There's ones that also look like a pair of scissors with a mesh ball in there. These are really the best kind to use. And basically they just, some of them open up, some have a bayonet mount like that. So you put the amount of tea in there that you need, and you close it up and sink that into your cup of hot water. Drape this over the side of the mug so you've got something to pick it up by that's not going to be too hot. And you can kind of bounce it a little to get the last few drops off of it. Do not smash your tea bags, and do not insist on forcing as much water out of here as possible. And the reason I say that is that tea has tannic acid, which is the same thing that you get out of your red wine. It gives you that feeling like your tongue is sticking to your teeth or the roof of your mouth. So what do you do with wine? If red wine is too tannic, too astringent like that, you serve cheese with it. And so now you've got an alkaline that's countering that acid. So what do you do with tea if it's too strong and has that bitterness to it? You add a little milk. And the milk, of course, provides that alkaline. Now you've neutralized the acid in that. So if you want a stronger cup of tea, you don't leave the tea bag or the tea infuser in the mug of water longer. You use more tea leaves. And I know that gets a little more expensive, but that's how you can get a stronger flavor, yet not an overly tannic tasting tea. And as I was saying, if you're squeezing these tea bags, then you're extracting more tannic acid out of that, and your tea is going to be just that much less drinkable. You need to follow the instructions on boxes when you buy tea. It'll give you some idea of how long you should leave that infused. I would recommend following that. You can always adjust on future mugs, and once you kind of get a particular brand down to where you know the strength that you enjoy, then you're good. With a tea infuser, you have to get used to how much to put in there, maybe using a small measuring spoon or something, and adjust cup by cup until you get it just the way you like it for that particular tea. one mistake a lot of people make is they're used to black tea having this nice rich color, and then they'll make green tea and it's so pale, they think, well, this isn't even going to taste like anything. I haven't extracted it long enough, and so they leave it in longer, and now they've got a bitter tea. Green tea is going to be very pale. Oolong tea is going to be somewhere in between those. So follow the instructions as they are given. When it comes to iced tea, one thing to keep in mind is if you are sweetening, you're going to want to sweeten the tea while it's hot. You don't do it while it's cold because it won't break down the granulated sugar. So if you are sweetening the tea as you're making it, or if you're sweetening it using simple syrup in a pitcher or bottle, jug of some kind, keep in mind that you need to use this up fairly quickly, because there is natural bacteria in the air and funguses and such that will want to eat that sugar. And so what ends up happening is you use a little bit out of your pitcher of iced tea and it gets down to a certain level and nobody's drank any for several hours. It starts building up some fungus in there and you don't see it. It's an invisible ring around the inside of that pitcher. If you put your finger on it, you can feel it. It's real slimy, but you can't see it. And so a lot of people don't even realize it's there. And the same thing will happen with your simple syrup. So maybe your tea keeps getting this pond scum taste to it and you can't figure out why, because you know you're cleaning the pitcher. It could be coming from your pitcher of simple syrup. And so I would also recommend not using plastic, because the porosity will harbor that fungus. So you want to go with either glass or stainless steel. Do not use aluminum. When we're talking about things like tannic acid, we're talking about acid, which will start breaking down the aluminum, and now you're drinking aluminum, which is certainly not recommended. So with that, I think I've pretty much covered everything we need to say about tea. So happy adventuring, and get out there and try some things. There's a lot of really unique tea out there to try. Thank you for your time, and appreciate it if you would give me a like, or better yet, a subscribe. And feel free to leave a comment or ask a question. Thanks for joining me.